Today I'm going to be taking a look at this Disc Maker's Reflex 4, which is a 4-drive disc duplicator. It duplicates both CDs and DVDs, and mostly all disc duplicators share the same kind of design, where it's just a case which holds many 5¼ inch drives, and there's one extra bay reserved for the controller board. And you can actually put in 5 drives if you ditch the controller board, but then, you're kind of limited in what it can do. So this particular one uses 4 older style parallel ATA DVD drives. It'll read and write both DVD-R and rewritable drives. And it also includes an internal 250 gig hard drive, so it can store disk images and you can just churn out 4 copies at a time, as opposed to having to read 1 disk and write to 3. I picked this one up for a specific project that I'm going to be working on. I'm still missing a part or 2 of the project, so we won't see that yet. I am going to release that in an upcoming video. When I got this thing, it had labels all over it that said "do not drop." So naturally it had a gigantic dent in the corner from where they dropped it. And now I've kind of got like a bent case. I've kind of banged out a bit of the dent, but not completely. So I'm gonna have to do a bit of work on this to get it a little bit cleaner. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect for what I'm using it for, but I'd like it a little bit better than this. It looks pretty messed up. Other than that, it arrived just fine, and it wasn't particularly cheap. I can at least sell the drives, because parallel ATA burners are at least somewhat uncommon for at least DVD drives. They started to transition to serial ATA pretty quickly after the release of DVD drives, so they weren't made in such high numbers, and they're usually a little bit more expensive. Around back, this is a pretty standard layout for one of these cases. It has a standard ATX power supply in the back. You can tell it's kind of an older unit, seeing as it has a little 115/230 volt switch. It just has a hard power switch and internal fan. There's also a fan up here, which is actually quite quiet. Both fans are pretty quiet in this thing. And it has a whole bunch of cutouts. Now, these cutouts show just how old a design these cases are and how they originate. These are cutouts for SCSI 1. These cases were originally designed to hold SCSI drives, and many controllers, including a controller that I'm going to be getting for this, use this form factor where it's just a little module that stick in. And there's also cutouts for DB25 and who knows what else. These could be barrel jacks or something. I'm not sure what it was originally designed for, but these are SCSI 1, and these would also be used for SCSI or possibly parallel. My particular unit doesn't get very far. As soon as you turn it on, it just says the boot up failed and you can't get out of it. I've tried starting up with different key combinations to see if you can bypass it or anything, but it seems like for whatever reason, like the BIOS on the board is just like totally fried. I've contacted the company, which then put me in touch with another company, because I guess they bought out that division of the company. They asked for information on it, and I've sent them it. Whether or not they send me the firmware, I don't know. Whether or not you can even flash the firmware on this thing properly after it's screwed up this bad, I don't know. But at least the drives work. I did actually test it using a different controller. I have another controller made by A-Card, and it's the same basic design, except this one only can communicate with 4 drives. This one actually supports many more drives. Remember, there's also a connection for the hard drive that's using up one of the ports, so this thing only really functions with 3 drives. It works just fine. This thing was able to read the hard drive, write to it, read and write to the drives, and they operate perfectly fine, so at least I can sell those. Even with the lid off, I'm gonna have to take this whole thing apart to really show off anything inside this, because the design of the case is rather overly engineered to make it very strong. I mean, other than the dent in the corner, this thing can take a serious beating. It's got rolled like cylindrical steel at the top, and just these like huge side panels. The whole chassis is just extremely strong. I mean, it makes it pretty heavy, but it is a decent trade-off for just raw strength. Now you can see the general overview of how this thing's set up. It's just a whole bunch of drives with some spare power connectors at the bottom, power supply, which is incredibly dusty, a hard drive, which I don't have all the screws into, that's why it's a little wobbly, a big mess of parallel ATA cables. I do not miss that. and the fan, and there's a little control module down here, which is actually pretty loose. And this is basically just telling the ATX power supply to turn on. And in the top slot here, we have the controller board. Hard drive is just a standard Hitachi DeskStar, 250 gig, parallel ATA, 7200 RPM. They use these standard brackets to convert the 5¼ inch bay here into one that can hold a regular 3½ inch hard drive. The controller board is essentially an ATX power supply connector and a little connector for a power switch, because there's a power switch on the front of the unit, and a little fan connector. Essentially what this does, when you hit the power switch on the front of the unit, it triggers the standby power to turn on the actual ATX power supply, and then the fan turns on, and that's pretty much all it's doing. Although it does have a whole bunch of resistors on it. I'm not 100% sure what it's doing. It does say it has like a current limit on it, so it might just be for current limiting. Power supply seems to be a pretty standard ATX power supply unit from a while ago, seeing as it basically just has Molex connectors. I don't think it's custom designed for this. It's hard to say, because you'd think it wouldn't have an ATX connector if it was specially designed for it. Like, why are there 3.3 volt rails and -12 and all that stuff? So it seems weird that there would be an ATX connector on something that was specifically designed for disk duplicators. And it even has a floppy drive connector on it. Where is it? There we go. Because a lot of the controller boards actually use floppy drive connectors for their power. The unit is an LCD320 EXP, which is a 320 watt unit. My intent is to basically use it regardless of if it's good or bad. It only pulls a maximum of about 50 watts using the older drives. If it just dies, it's not a big deal. I'm not overly concerned. I can always replace it with basically anything. Doing a little research, I determined that it's probably made by LC Power Supplies, which from what I can tell are crap. Internally, this thing doesn't look terrible. It actually looks like it's half decent. I can't say for certain on some of the capacitors because they're just hard to spot, but it does look like everything's pretty well heat sinked. There's thermal cutoffs, there's thermal sensors for the fan. Wiring looks decent. I can't say it's the best power supply I've ever seen, but it's certainly not the worst. So yeah, that should work just fine for what I need it to do. These are the two controller boards I have. They're basically the same thing, even though they're made by different companies. The units have either a separate controller. These are dual parallel ATA controllers providing the 4 ports. So there's 2 of them. Or in this case of this one, it's got some custom controller that handles all 8 parallel ATA ports that are on this one. On this one, they were only using a few because there's the hard drive and then the 4 drives. They had 3 spare, so they have different models which they offer, which have many more drives, including bigger controllers that have double the number of drives. I think they sell like 15 drive units. Basically have the same architecture where they have some memory, probably more memory. This looks like it's 100 megahertz DRAM, a BIOS. In this case, this one has 3. It's got a flash, standard like Intel NAND flash, and then it's got 2 BIOS chips, so whatever. Different architecture. This one also has an optional Ethernet port. I noticed the layout underneath this sticker looks like it's an Ethernet jack, and then there's a little pad here for presumably a controller or maybe just the PHY. This one, I couldn't find any information on the chips, but presumably this is a microcontroller because it's tied into the LCD and it's probably handling all the user interface and just standard stuff like that. And it will have the aforementioned controller that's actually handling all the data transfer because it's got to send it to all these drives simultaneously. Some programming headers. These things commonly have lots of GPIO and other stuff because they're used in customized applications. The smaller unit has a bunch of outputs. I think they're all GPIO or possibly just LED indicators for the various drives. A simple operating system that just handles all the inputs and translates that into commands for the drives. They do make newer ones with tons of serial ATA ports. These ones are both parallel ATA, so they're kind of wasteful in their space. This controller board is rather large because of all these connectors, plus there's also the giant bundle of cables that come off the board to all the drives, which means the actual chassis is quite a bit longer than it really needs to be if you were using smaller connectors. If you replace it all with serial ATA. Moose, if the lights are too bright for you, why did you come up here? It's too bright for you. You're always squinting. Silly cat. Thanks. No, it's okay. Eat the lens. That's fine. That's fine. I'm only filming. It's fine. Mine came with a nice catalog for all the different models you can buy from disc makers, including ones that do automatic printing and labeling, and while they sell a lot of stationery and cases and stuff like that. These are pretty common too. These duplicate flash drives. They also make ones that do SD cards and CF cards. These are all units that print, so they'll print on the disc and then continue on or label them in some other fashion. And they're all generally a lot more automated than the one I have. It'll churn out proper discs that you can sell. Oh, that's funny. This is a shrink wrapping machine with like a spool of cellophane and a little heat gun. Cute.